for that.
No, page 259. In the in the first article, Fanon reviewed the history of and principles.
259. Okay, cool. I'm there.
All right, I'm going to go back a little bit, so just stay there.
Okay. Well, you can just tell me where you're going back to, and I can read.
I'm going to be there very shortly. By the time you find it, I'll be back already where you're at.
Okay.
The two articles in which the work on day hospitalization in Tunis is discussed. The first article was by Fanon alone, and second was written by the collaborations of Dr. Dramani, a former intern at Belinda and a committed colleague in Tunis. The first article is primarily empirical, showing the impressive results achieved through the day hospitalization in an underdeveloped country. The second is mainly theoretical discussion discussing the values and limits of day hospitalization. The first article also in telling illustration of how rigorously empirical Fanon's pursued problems when time and resources permitted. This point is important because his works that were translated into English do not reflect it, and some, like Wadis, have thereby concluded that Fanon was unempirical and a man given to wild speculation, which is incorrect. In the first article, Fanon reviewed the history and principles of the, quote, open door policy of psychiatric care. Traditional hospitalization removed the patient from his social milieu and hence his conflictual and necessary milieu. The institution promised to offer a, quote, protective shield to the patient from society and to the society from the patient and to the patient from himself. But this proved to be a false protection in all three respects. Hospitalization became, in effect, a brutal internment characterized by repression, lethargy, and deep day hospitalization was turned in Tunis with the goals first of early diagnosis as well as early treatment, and second to keeping the patient in maximal contact with the exterior social milieu, and of course visibility restriction. Fanon pointed out that at the time they started day hospitalization in Tunis, there existed, quote, at most 20 day hospitals in the world, all in highly industrialized countries, and never an experience of the day hospital was attempted in an underdeveloped country. In reality, the total number of day hospitals then is subject to debate, but it's clear that Fanon was unaware of the interesting and pioneering work of Dr. Lambo in Nigeria. Nonetheless, the questions Fanon posed were pertinent from a methodological standpoint. Can day hospitalizations be valuable and effective in underdeveloped countries like Tunis? From a doctrinal standpoint, can this type of service meet all the psychiatric demands of such a country? Day hospital service in Tunis was started as a component of Charles Nicolle Hospital, a general hospital that had a neuropsychiatric unit for more than 40 years. It had a different policy for admissions than traditional asylums, but it relied on the same rigid, repressive, and punitive measures. Like asylums of the worst type, it used straitjackets, cells, bars, closed doors, and the other ugly tools of large establishments. The Tunisian government wanted to expand its psychiatric facilities, but the futility of building the same old structures became obvious. A plan for a day hospital was therefore considered, the eventual implemented within the Charles Nicolle Hospital. It was agreed that the new day hospital remained of small capacity, that its its quote therapeutic efficiency can be rationally studied and argumented. How the plan was implemented and the role given to patients are themselves noteworthy. The Minister of Health having boldly endorsed the plan, a team of patients who was put to work to demolish the prison-like cells, the bars, the straitjackets, the handcuffs, and all the instruments of incarceration and repression were removed. The building was renovated and refurbished. The new center was limited to 80 beds, 40 men and 40 women. 60 small beds were, in addition, reserved for children in the women's section. The old staff, who accustomed to the sadomasochistic relations of the old institution, looked at the patients not as, quote, the most important part of the service, but rather as variable enemies of the personal tranquility was transferred. A new, better educated staff was employed, and rigorous training was high premium placed on competence and a, quote, welcoming attitude towards patients. Each member was in charge of no more than 6 to 8 patients with whom he or she worked every day and throughout the period of their hospitalization. The quality and efficiency, efficacy of communication between patients and personnel, between relatives and personnel, and between staff and doctors in charge were particularly emphasized. There was regular psychological and medical surveillance. Patients' dreams, anxieties, relations with family members, sleeping habits, and behaviors in the center were carefully recorded. New crises for relapses were immediately attended to and monitored. Along or accompanied by relatives, patients arrived at the neuropsychiatric day center at 7 a.m. and stayed there until 5 p.m. The center closed its doors by 6 when all the patients left for home. Except on Sundays, the center provided daily services. On arrival in the center, each patient was received by an assigned staff member who, after breakfast was served, reviewed the patient's medical and psychological regimen. Therapeutic activities were carefully planned by maximal effect and tailored to the needs of each patient. These included psychotherapy, sleep and relaxation therapy, and insulin therapy, electroshock therapy, and chemotherapy. Some of these techniques are today considered and are what's that word? Archaic and even brutal. What Fanon used them showed how much he was rooted in his own time, even as his endeavor to question and transcend it. In particular, interest is the form of psychotherapy Fanon employed. His approach to psychotherapeutic techniques was what today may be called eclectic. Eclectic. He employed psychoanalytic therapy, behavioral therapy, and existentialist-orientated psychotherapy. In particular, Fanon adopted Sandro Frenenzi's psychoanalytic techniques, in which the therapist takes an active and an involved role in therapy. The behavioral technique he utilized were based on the pavilion therapy of second signal system, along with individuals and group therapy. What?
It's based on the Pavlovian theory.
Thank you. He used social drama, for which the content significantly was biographical rather than functional. Patients were encouraged to recount their personal experience to the group, who in turn gave their opinion, criticism, support, and the opportunity for feedback as a, quote, identification through mirror. Each patient was encouraged to confront himself and others through verbalization, implications, and taking a stand. But attacking a patient, conscious or being, was at all times avoided. Patients did not pay the doctor a fact that was carefully taken into account because it modified the quality of transference and countertransference. A major portion of the article empirically describes the demographic and diagnostic characters of the patients seen during the first 18 months of the center's existence. Data from 1958 to 1959 are compared and contrasted at some changes and remarkable accomplishments are shown for that period. During the last 7 months of 1958, 345 patients were admitted to the center. The volume of admission almost doubled in the next 11 months to a total of 670 patients. Thus, during the 18th months, considered over 1,000 patients were admitted, of whom fewer than 0.88% required full hospitalization in 20 months. More than 1,200 were admitted and treated with the average durations of stay shortened to 25 days. No self-unaliving, homicide, or violence of medical legal import occurred during this period. It's my voice, that's why I'm not so like, yeah, and that. So it's my voice, everybody. My voice, it's my voice. This level of efficiency and efficacy is particularly remarkable when one considers that during the first year, there was only one chief of the service who, in the absence of the intern, absence of the interns, quote, assumed all needs of the 80 patients. We are not informed who that clinical director was, although one suspects it may have been Fanon himself. In a footnote to the second article of the day hospitalization, written in collaborations with Dr. Geronimi, another intriguing point is made that one of the two doctors had started the first day hospital in Algeria. If in fact it was Fanon who started the first day hospital in Algeria, more research is needed on his work at Belinda. An impressive result of the first article are actually exceeded by the poignant theoretical and humanistic articulations of the second article. Oh my gosh, another one? Jesus Christ. The latter focuses on considerations of doctrine and the values and limits of day hospitalization. Fanon and Geronimi pointed out that two characteristics distinguishes their psychiatric day center from the other psychiatric establishments in Tunis. First was its attachment to a general hospital, and second, its formula of hospitalization, quote unquote. Given the social stigma and isolations of traditional asylums, the author emphasized the need for integrating psychiatric care on the professional and material infrastructures of a general hospital. Such an interrogation makes possible effective utilizations of the service of internists, radiologists, surgeons, and other who can immensely contribute to patients' care. It can also rehabilitate the psychiatrist in the eyes of his colleagues, since his isolation is closed. Asylum coffers on him a, quote, mysterious and taken together disquieting, end quote, character. But most of all, in the eyes of the patient, the psychiatrist becomes a doctor among other doctors, and the mental patient comes to be viewed only as a, quote, sick person, like other sick persons. More fundamentally than their endorsement of the medical model is the theoretical and moral justification they offer for day hospitalization. They argue that day hospitalization breaks away from the brutal practice of coercion, as well as confinement, and most of all, that it aims to restore the freedom of the patient. The Liberty Day hospitalization coffers is, they regretfully admit, never real and complete. For it is indeed relative and limited. What is more, there is often the temptation of doctors to oppose the exit the exit of an obviously very ill patient who would rather have his freedom than be hospitalized. The doctors in the center sometimes succumbed to this temptation, but very rarely. The authors nonetheless emphasize that their experience applied amply demonstrates that partial hospitalization that permits patients to go to their homes and immerse themselves in the world of relations is more acceptable to them than therapeutically more effective. Day hospitalization, they point out, minimizes the dialectic of the slave master or the prisoner jailer relationship that characterizes traditional approaches. The sadomasochistic relations engendered by confinement and isolations are also attenuated. The doctor-patient relationship regains its quote, sense of normalcy, end quote.
It's attenuated.
Thank you. The counter becomes more and more the meeting of, quote, two free people, which is necessary in all therapy and more so in psychiatry, end quote. The patient comes out without coercion. He also leaves without feeling an unrealistic gratitude to the doctor who allowed it. Confinement disarms the patient, forces him to give himself up completely. It is a battle between unequals and a submission to the doctor's every whim. Quote, day hospitalization, on the other hand, offers a passive support, a monetary freedom of reinforcements of a personality like a prolonged and therapeutic visit. Basic to the doctrine enunciated is a particular conception of psychopathology, a firm commitment to the being of the patient, and a therapeutic approach aimed to restore freedom in the very society in which it was lost. Wildness comes to be defined as a pathology of liberty. The patient's liberty is constantly undermined psychologically by anxieties, obsessions, inhibitions, contradictions, and socially by victimization, rejections, coercions, and confinement. Denying his right of liberty by force within and without, the patient is condemned to exercise his liberty in an unreal world of phantoms. Traditional psychiatry simply reinforces and legitimizes this brutal reality, even as it ostensibly claims to have the interest of the patient at heart. It is from this perspective that one can appreciate, quote, the attitude of revolt, end quote, against hospitalization found among patients who are at least disorganized, those who still retain a measure of an active self and have not yet renounced their world of relations. Although day hospitalization is accepted by such patients, those who have an inactive self and have renounced life in real world prefer complete hospitalization. These are the ones who have totally succumbed to the pathology of liberty. The therapist must understand and reinforce this attitude of revolt as he combats this tendency to surrender liberty. Fanon and Geronimi emphasize that the real context of social therapy is the dynamic and living society itself. No genuine healing or restoration of liberty can be effected apart from it. In fact, their disillusionment with the institutional therapy that Tosquelles pioneered is clear, although they concede its advantages in large and dehumanizing asylums. They point out that in each establishment, the neo-society of institutional therapy was at important advance because it counteracts the regressive tendency of patients as it offers them a modicum of social contact and tasks in a closed asylum. It also helped the therapist to understand what could have, quote, happened outside, while the fruitfully studying mechanisms like identification, protection, and instinctual inhibition. But then comes this incisive critique. Here's a critique. It must always be remembered that with, oh my gosh, stop making me have to approve. It must also be remembered that with institutional therapy, we create frozen institution, strict and rigid rules, schemes which rapidly become stereotypical in the neo-society. There is no innovation, no creative dynamism, no newness. There seems to be no viable dislocation, no crises. The institution remains that a cadaveric foundation in which Masu speaks. Moreover, the inert character of the pseudo-society, its strict spatial limitations, the restricted numbers of movement, and why hide it? The actual experience of confinement, imprisonment, considerably limits the curative and rehabilitative value of its social therapy. That is why we believe today that the true milieu for social therapy is concrete society itself. So he's saying that society has to play its role too, and they have to understand that there are relations in society which brings that pathology. Day hospitals keep the patients in the social and familial milieu out of which his problems arose, in which he must take his rightful place. The therapist every day confronts a living person having active relations with the living world. This patient has not, quote, cut antenna, so to speak. At night, and whenever the patient closes, he returns to his family and friends. On his way to and from the center, he rides the bus or train with others whom he knows in his neighborhood and place of work. One took special care to avoid disengagement of others from the patients and of the patients from others. At all times, his world of relations retains its reality and density. The therapist therefore faced, on the one hand, a personality in crisis at the very heart of its environment, and on the other hand, a real dynamic and active society in the very heart of the patient. It is from this perspective that one clearly observes the rupture in the, quote, synthetic unity of the person to his milieu and seeks to restore that unity. Symptoms and troubled affectivity are no longer abstract or isolated from their source. They are offered dialectically, and therapist thinks and acts dialectically. One is forced to abandon the symbolic imaginary games of institutional therapy and becomes immersed in society itself, not its caricature. This orientation to the dynamic and living reality forces the rethinking of conceptions and techniques. The reunification of descriptive semology and nosology gives way to an existential approach that takes into account the activities, assaults, and vulnerabilities of the self in the dynamic social milieu. It is in this psychosocial dialect that the therapist decides the time, place, and type of his intervention. At the center, the patient is provided with his own space. His privacy is respected, and no demand is made upon his liberties or immediate appearances. He wears and brings what he wants. What is questioned is not, quote, the form of his being, end quote, but rather, quote, the form of his existence. Fanon and Geromini included that day hospitalization is inappropriate in cases in which, quote, the organic participation in the illness is massive and dominant, therefore requires constant medical surveillance. However, they add that even for such cases, thanks to chemotherapy, the period of complete hospitalization could be reduced and early transfer to day hospitalization becomes possible. The other categories they thought inappropriate for day hospitalization are patients who present clear dangers to others and to themselves. And of course, those in police custody. They further emphasized that each center be small and, quote, avoid at all costs the creation of those monsters, which are classical psychiatric hospitals. Significantly, they urged stronger legislation for patients' rights and appropriate consideration for those who live in distant and rural areas. Their last sentence is most noteworthy. In summary, a very strict legislation should be established, guaranteeing to the maximum the liberty of the patients to get rid of every incarcerative and coercive aspect of internment. This was Fanon's psychiatry until his death at the age of 36. The noble project of restoring liberty to the captives of colonialism and of the psychiatric establishment had only begun when he died. There have been some advances made here and there, but the project still awaits realization. Liberty continues to elude the majority, whether colonized or neo-colonized, incarcerated or overdrugged. A small elite, sham and corrupt, has usurped what many have fought, bled, and dreamed for in those colonies that Europe underdeveloped to develop itself. The mental health and professions, too, has betrayed its declared goals of prevention and healing once it joined in the ramparts of profit, power, and control. It caters willingly to those who can afford it, at the same time neglect or abusing those victims for whom hope of liberty remains frustrated. Fanon presents an alternative for those who desire that the tools never possess. Oh my gosh, I gotta do it again? They don't like me today. Own personal and professional life. The letter of resignation he wrote while in Belinda is a moving and principled document, rare in psychological literature. It summarized the revolutionary and humanistic thrust of his psychiatry. If psychiatry is a medical technique that aims to enable a man no longer to be a stranger to his environment, I owe it to myself to affirm that the colonized, and we may add the patient, permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. The function of this social structure is to set up institutions to serve man's need. A society that drives its members to desperate solutions is a non-viable society, a society to be replaced. It is the duty of the citizens to say this. No professional morality, no class solidarity, no desire, no wash to wash the family linen in private can have a prior claim. No pseudo-national mystification can prevail against the requirements of reason. End of that chapter, everybody. Chapter 12. Any questions?
I don't have any questions, but I'd like to say that I completely and utterly support and it's just amazing, and it's so sad that they're trying to bring us back to before Fanon and them were fighting for our liberty.
Thank you. Towards a Psychology of Liberation, Chapter 12. For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, we must work out new concepts and try to set afoot a new man, Fanon, wretched of the earth. These are the last words in Fanon's last book. He intended them for people of color, the oppressed, those who for too long looked to Europe for inspiration, models, and guidance. But the oppressed are everywhere, and Fanon urging to fashion new concepts and to set afoot a new person should speak to everyone, or almost everyone, in this chapter that I conclude that in the intellectual excursion we made into a rugged landscape of oppression, into a distant past reviewing the violence of slavery, into the recent past recalling the fire and fury with which colonization proceeded, and into into the present, sketching the plight of black people pinned in ghettos and multiple forms of death. I attempt to place these developments within the broader historical perspective, hoping to show the underlining much of the violence that exploded to an unprecedented scale in the world was a greed for profit, a boundless wish for self-aggrandizement, and a sedimented Manichaean psychology. Underscore was the fact that amnesia for the painful past may be a convenient defense, but never a reliable foundation for programs and amelioration and development. Thus focused on racism, I reviewed recurrent pronouncements of scholars, discussed the roles of psychology and medicine in the oppression, examined different manifestations of violence, ventured into a social genie of wildness, and explored various paradigms that seem pertinent to the psychology of oppression. The guide and inspiration of this difficult, but I hope worthwhile sojourning was Frantz Fanon's, whose thought practice a person I set out to interpret and clarify. Although a great deal has been written on Fanon, it seems to me necessary to present a comprehensive discussion of his psychological contributions and to offer data that support his seminal ideas. I did so not only to familiarize others with his little known psychological contributions, but also to affirm Fanon's historical and intellectual significance for oppressed people of color. Of course, Fanon was by no means infallible, nor was his analysis without problems. For to claim otherwise is simply to wade in dogma and the cult of personality. In addition to Fanon's controversial assertions on violence and social classes, one could very well show the serious problems arose because his over-reliance on the medical model. Fanon's unqualified endorsement of violence and the wretched of the earth confounds the humanistic kernel of his overall thought and contradicts his own clinicianal illustration of how violence begets further violence, as well as other unanticipated implications in the lives of the survivors. It seems to me that the same Fanonian thesis on violence could offer an analysis and process of decolonization without the hysterical celebration of counter-violence in all conditions of oppression. Moreover, his contention that wildness is the result of social historical predicaments, but his reliance on medical means, diagnosis, and treatment pose fundamental problems explored by him and his contemporaries. Nonetheless, I decide to emphasize his positive contributions, partly because this seemed a necessary first step, and partly to salvage valuable and seminal insights from the ravaging critiques. Better the wrecking operation of those who would have us seek no personal models or theoretical paradigms, but those that are Eurocentric and theirs. What Fanon committed himself to was not a search for elegance in paradigms shorn to lived experience, nor a sterile monologues monologues and of intellectual cutoffs from the trivial aspirations and struggle of people. Rather, he was a commitment, or rather he was a commitment to living beings and into any actions, clinical practice, writings, and revolutionary violence that restored the integrity of people and the basic human values. It so happens that those who attack his persons and ideas forget that there is a violent history to be reckoned with, that generations have been denied the authentic biography and history, and that his attack on Fanon is not unrelated to that historical violence on people of color. For when Europe unleashed its avarice upon the rest of the world, it globalized human bondage and drastically changed the character of oppression. Europe's encroachment on self-aggrandizement brought forth slavery, colonialism, apartheid, racism, and, in Fanon words, an avalanche of murders. Through plunder of land and labor, with bayonets and the Bible, Europe developed itself and simultaneously underdeveloped people of color. Europe's stubborn wish to own and control transformed various peoples into the owned and controlled. Europe's greed to have more also forced many into being less. To be less, yeah, that's it. The less, yeah. The victims of this violence span eras of continents. The bloated belly of an African child in the refugee camp, or the tormented residents at Soweto, controlled with awesome power, today bears testimony to the same victimization, as does the dejection look of a black American in a prison, a mental institution, or a decrepit housing project. The millions of slaves lost in the Middle Passage, the ravages of tribal wars instigated to divide and rule, the ruthless exploitation of every human and material resources. All these still remain sedimented in social existence and in the deeper recesses of the psyche. There are also many victims whose plight is hardly heard or seen. These include Native Americans, Australian Aboriginal people, and the Moors and the Maori of New Zealand. In other words, the human wreckage of European avarice and violence. Oh my gosh, I get it. Not approved. Just leave me alone. Where was I at? Avarice and violence is strewn everywhere. No ecology, no culture, no psyche remains untarnished. It has been said that those who do not know the past are doomed to repeat it. Ideally, it should be possible to know and write about our infamous past without blaming contemporaries for it. Each of us should be judged, held accountable, and confronted, not for crimes for past generations, but for the actions he or she takes in our time and with respect to the living, to inspire feelings of guilt for the inhumanity of one predecessor, or of shame for the dehumanization of one's ancestors, has not been my aim. But if neither can be helped in reviewing that past, I believe guilt and shame can be used constructively as lessons for the future and the impetus for proactive, preventive action. Indeed, the familiar distinction between victims and villains, development and underdevelopment, civility and barbarity, sanity and wildness are becoming increasingly blurred. There are no doubt those who still profit from the deliberately carry on the historic violence. Yet for most persons, white or black, the bankrupt legacy infused with the Manichaean psychology exacts its toll, directly or indirectly. What we are born into, that legacy of socialized at a tender age, is one or the other camp of the Manichaean world. It's beyond our choice and responsibility. To live it uncritically and to be outlived by the legacy without taking part in an effort to change it is, however, a matter of personal choice and responsibility. The focus of this work has been clearly on the historic violence of Europe on people of color. However, to infer from this conclusion an inherent criminality or defect in Europeans or their descendants amounts to sheer racism and is contrary to my and Fanon's aim. Certainly, violence is not a monopoly of Europe or of its descendants. Some African governments, such as the one over which Idi Amin once presided, have also affected oppression and wanton murders in their own people. This fact should serve as a sobering antidote to anti-white racism. A reversal of the Manichaean psychology where black people hurl insults, stones, and steel on whites is non-avoidable solution, and no amount of blaming others can justify an envision of responsibility to change what is. There are certainly many whites who themselves have been victims of that historic violence discussed in this work, and many black people who willingly served it complicitly with oppression, including slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. In other words, skin color is not a badge of criminality or innocence, but rather a personal stand taking as evidence of one or the other. During the past 2 decades, one talked about neo-colonialism that indeed was real and pervasive. Today, however, there is an accumulating evidence that auto-colonialism, quote unquote, the highest phase of social oppression, has emerged under the leadership of the homebred tyrants, callous and inept dictators like the ones currently reigning over many African countries are, of course, not new in human history. Now and then one found, quote, village dictators, end quote, who obsessed with the need for abject loyalty and with continuing their ineptitude, knew little else but to rule by terror tactics and summary executions. The African tyrants of today, many of them products of the colonial servitude, rule with lethal arms sent as, quote, aid by more, quote, developed countries in the manner of reminiscent of the way firearms and gunpowder were shipped to Africa during the slave trade. He's talking about comprador classes and how they were set up to serve the needs of those forces. We said earlier that the oppressed deny individual biographies and collective history, or made appendages to the biographies and history of others. In a very real sense, Europe assault on people of color brought forth a legacy of self-expansion and entitlement on the one hand, and self-diminution and deprivation on the other. This legacy has become so integral to everyday living and prevailing consciousness that one takes it for granted, almost as one does the raising and setting of the sun or the blossom of foliage and foliage of the seasons. Earlier chapters discussed multiple forms of death and the immense loss of, quote, person years. This historic violence has entailed for black people. Psychologists would certainly do well never to mask this fact with postulates of, quote, aggressive instincts, innate and fixed, that make everyone and in the end non-responsible. To this day, it is the Europeans and their descendants who are competing for world dominance. The two superpowers are posed by nuclear holocaust, an absolute catastrophe for all. If one or the other cannot have its way and impose its whims, the earth has been voraciously disemboweled of its resources and its inhabitants. used as objects and disposed of at will. Indeed, with the doomsday clock moving to a just few minutes before midnight to emphasize current perils of nuclear war, the historical self-aggrandizement and avarice for control have now reached extremely dangerous heights. The ultimate of antisocial and self-destructive wildness. It is obviously in everyone's interest to no longer acquiesce for fear of losing the security of the herd. The competitions for dominance and the self-aggrandizement is now spilled over to utter space, while the immense toll of the reckless venturers begun a few centuries earlier to take its toll through the air we breathe, the water we drink, the environment we inhabit, the carcinogens we cannot avoid, the neighbor we learn to distrust, the lethal arms build up in many corners of the world, and the anxiety of imminent destruction we try to repress. Those in the so-called underdeveloped countries who have decided to catch up with the quote developing countries need to rethink what it is they want to catch up with, which genuine contributions of Europe they must adopt, and what of their own they would do well to retain. There's no necessary correlation between the development of things and the advancement of people. And if such a correlation were to hold, Euro-America was yet to exemplify it with the certainty that a superficial look or a self-conceit may suggest. One has only to visit a quote nursing home, quote unquote, into which the elderly are dumped in psychiatric institutions in which overdrugged zombies moved aimlessly and with blank stares, a ghetto where many sleep hungry or homeless immense plenty, and even the home of a well-to-do family whose members daily pop pills to find the calm, not to mention the serenity that eludes homo consuming. On the contrary, it seems that those who turn into forming and molding things have come to dominate nature, rule the world, all the while dehumanizing others and themselves. Those who turn to people elaborating a human-centered culture in which even things are imputed with an anthropomorphic attributes, have become defenseless victims to the predation of the former and to such natural disasters as drought and disease. Is this pattern really inevitable? Or is it possible to have a world in which the worth and relations of people are not compromised while nature is creatively transformed to fulfill human needs? Can psychologists, as much as it is their vocation to search for solutions to human problems by human means, contribute to changing or sharing legacies of violence in the contemporary dilemma? It is obvious that history is made and group identities reclaimed not on account of psychologists and their theories, but as a result of the organized and willed action of social groups. Equally obvious is that human suffering, known for time immemorial, and in every society finds no panacea in modern psychotherapy, quote unquote, which only has a history of about 100 years. In reality, modern psychotherapy is thus far limited to only a few societies, and for that matter, mainly for a few social classes within those societies. The commodification of therapy. What is more, behavioral scientists who study social impression concur that psychology has traditionally served the function of social control rather than of social change. and that, quote, modern psychotherapy, end quote, if made available to and accepted by the oppressed, tend to emphasize self-comparison, self-compromised adjustments, not self-liberating revolt to an intolerable status quo of oppression. Yet to leave matters, there adds nothing but another note of premises, of pessimism in a domain of human relations in which, because of oppression, pessimism and cynicism are rife. There is certainly little to be gained by throwing out the baby, in this case psychology, with the bathwater, i.e. psychology, history of race, class, and sex bias. For however, inwardly, they use inward with ARDLY. So, yay, is traditional guardians may have appeared to the oppressed. Psychology can contribute immensely to the struggle of the oppressed. So we can use psychotherapy as a tool of liberation instead of a tool of exploitation and profit. But this cannot happen in the absence of fundamental change in a parochial values and limited priorities of establishment psychology. There can be indications that Euro-American psychologists are gradually, quote, desegregating, end quote, their theories as well as their practice. Various instructive critiques of traditional tenets and practice have increasingly emerged within psychology during the past 2 decades, exposing unrecognized culture, class, and sex biases of psychologists. People of color have also joined the field in steady but growing numbers since Fanon's death, bringing with them different experiences and alternative formulations. As classrooms and neighborhoods increasingly desegregate to reflect the diversity of races and cultures, so too will the intellectual tenets of social doctrines inevitably become less Eurocentric and hegemonic. Such a diversification in theory and practice should be celebrated rather than lamented. There we go. For psychology will be enriched to the extent that it incorporates diverse cultures' experience. It will merit claims to, quote, human science to the degree it is suffused with different value orientations, and will also make significant strides in social responsibilities inasmuch as it gates are open and various clientele. This work, as its title shows, has been concerned primarily with the psychology of oppression and with the contributions of one psychologist namely Frantz Fanon. To write on the psychology of liberation was not its aim, because, as pointed out earlier, there was first a need to clearly define problems, place them in historical as well as a conceptual perspective. What I therefore present in these last pages is only a broad outline for a psychology of a liberation. I will address here only questions of priorities and perspectives, but differ issues and techniques and techniques and tactics. A degree of oversimplification of the major socio-historical developments and elaborate psychological traditions seem inevitable in any brief discussion, though I hope that the following suggestions offer stimulant thought. These essential points I have discussed can be summarized thus, quote, underlining much of the prevailing psychological theory and practice are the ethics of individualism, the ideal of individual autonomy, and particular conception of basic human needs, as well as the exclusive emphasis on individual change, which together reflect fundamental culture as well as class bases. And B, one essential precondition for a psychology of a liberation is to reformulate the psychological outlook, basic human needs, a focal of change in ways that take into account the priorities and frustrations of the oppressed. Any questions before I go on to the next chat?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. For individualism to collective well-being. Next section. Insomuch as it concerns itself with human realities of a given era and a particular social group, psychology inevitably remains integral to the historical and cultural current. I gotta do a puzzle piece because these guys just don't like me. For instance, looming large in psychological literature is the emphasis of individualism. Informing most therapeutic interventions is also the ideal of individual liberty. Thus, the various personality theories, and indeed the pivotal role of personality in psychology, shows this emphasis on individuals as a unit of analysis and primary concern. Diagnostics classifications are also about individuals, or more specifically, more symptoms and traits of individuals commonly shorn of their dynamic and relational essence. Therapeutic goals are equally about the attainment of, or restoration or adjustment, adaptation, equilibrium, competence, and or autonomy in individuals. This emphasis on the individualism and the ideal of individual autonomy has deep historical roots in the cultural and economic evolution of Europe and North America. To attempt here even the modest discourse and these social historical developments and their psychoaffective consequences should surely take us far beyond our intent. But several points should be emphasized. Philosophical debates on, quote, individual liberty had gained increasing currency from the 17th century on a country in which capitalism burgeoned. The capitalist mode of production and its ethics of maximizing profit conditioned is a rapid erosion of traditional bonds and social values. Protections in these countries require, on the one hand, the attenuation of social legal obstacles to the accumulation of profit for the bourgeoisie, and on the other, the isolation and reduced resistance of workers who, as individuals, could enter into contractual relationships to sell their labor. Thus, almost from the start, the ethics of individualism and the idea of individual liberty were Janus faced. On the one hand, they implied freedom of unfettered development and privatization of social privileges to the interest of those with capital. On the other hand, they entailed a weakening of resistance among workers by reducing them into socially defenseless individuals who privatized their collective victimization. By the 20th century, the ethics of individualism and idealization of individual liberty reached their zenith in North America and Western Europe. Associated with these were also the cult of individual privacy and the assumption of necessary conflict between the individual and society. From the perspective of those who enjoy economic and political privileges, it was a question of enjoying, without referenced privileges that had become, quote, rights, extended these privileges into every aspect of their life, and most certainly barring any infringement of them by society. More particularly, the amorphous mass of have-nots, the imperatives of capital development, combined with rapid migration, urbanization, technological advances, and new patterns of industrial production, that together provided a material impetus for individualism and compartmentalization of life, were stimulated. Everyday living gradually became more atomized, leaving most persons only tenuous and shifting social anchors. A markedly self-centered and schizoid orientation toward life and other become institutionalized and normalized. Moreover, having become the measure of being, time a commodity to be gained or lost, and relations with others a matter to be justified in the balance sheet of economic assets and liabilities. The discipline of psychology emerged in this social, historical, and cultural context. The ethic of individualism and the ideal of individual autonomy were thus inevitably incorporated into these theories and techniques. Indeed, psychology, in the generic sense, we have been seeing. Hence, it includes psychiatry, flourished and gained currency through its efforts to deal with the psychological problems spawned by rapid social change, intensifying class conflict at home, and raging wars abroad. Rather, these dealings have served the function of rehabilitation, the amalgamation, or the social control of reunification is a matter still hotly contested. The crucial point to emphasize here is the psychology has been embedded in the socio-historical and cultural context that gives it life and relevance. Development in the social environment that extols the ethic of individualism and an idea of individual autonomy. It was axiomatic and expected that psychology too would incorporate these ethics and ideals in its theories and practice. Without such embeddedness in the, how do you say that word? I can't say it. Consonants? Consonants. Is that right? Consonants? Consonants? Are you there?
My eyes were closed. These words are so.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay.
Give me a headache. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. No, you're fine. I understand. Sometimes when I read my next book that I study, I sometimes have a problem with my eyes. So I have to have like really bright lights to be able to see it.
Consonants.
Yeah, that's right. Consonants. A repetition of consonant sounds within nearby words, particularly at the end of syllables or words.
Consonants.
Consonants with the values and needs of its community, psychology, would have little relevance to those who primarily seek its service, finds its research, and share its promises. But fundamentally, problems arise when this psychology is underlining ethics and ideals are readily assumed to reflect the values and properties of peoples everywhere. To be sure, individuality and the idea of individual autonomy are not inherently negative or problematic. Rather, their salience and actual realization depend on where one is situated in the social order, and the well-to-do can extol the ethics of individuality and search for individual autonomy because their collective liberty is already realized. Their clamor for, quote, individual rights, end quote, is but a wish to further extend and refine that collective freedom. What is more, their collective freedom and individual rights essentially boil down to an absence of restraint from the full enjoyment of privileges and possibilities that too frequently amounts to the absence of restraint from imposing their will and interests on others. In short, their collective liberties was obtained through violence, and their individual rights are but condensed social violence. The oppressed, in contrast, can hardly speak of, quote, individual rights, so long as the collective liberty is usurped and denied. Liberty they seek is a, quote, a recognition of fulfillment of necessity, end quote, inasmuch as their basic human needs are frustrated and their humanity stunted. It is therefore the attainment of collective liberty that takes precedence, since without any extension or refinement of individual rights is impossible. Indeed, the adoption of individualism leaves the oppressed defenseless, divided, and highly prone to capitulation. The aim of personal salvation when one's group is oppressed is often a chimera, and if attained, involves one or another form of alienation and sometimes even outright self and or collective betrayal. The contrast of predicaments can be underscored by the realities of well-to-do and the poor in urban America. Thus, for instance, one finds elaborate legal and social safeguards for the property, persons, and even privacy of the former group. The privileges they enjoy in society, favorable conditions for accumulations of surplus value, highly profitable tax loopholes, better educational opportunities, access to the best legal defense, latent measures in cases, criminal acts. These are carried out into the interpersonal domain in family life. Their home is like a proverbial castle, quote unquote, protected by laws and well-built structures. Each member of the family claims his or her part in the family's privileges and seeks to give all expressions. The individuality. Each acts as a majority of one, particularly in encounters with the oppressed. The family boundary and the relations within it remain relatively sacrosanct, with little interference by the state and its machinery of control unless there is a major or noticeable disaster. The poor, in contrast, have little or no properties to protect. Their bodily and psychological integrity are constantly violated. Their space and density permit little privacy. Educational opportunities, work conditions, tax laws, and administrations of justice, all these and more work against them. The frequent coming and goings of landlords, police officers, social workers, and a host of others render their homes more like an inescapable and disarming trap than the protective and protected castles. The provision of state aid to meet basic needs of nutrition and shelter entails state interference in family life. Whose lives there, who relates to whom, and what happens in the family is scrutinized by officials, mental health workers, and representatives of the welfare department. In many instances, to be a father and unemployed means to forfeit membership in one's family, leaving behind morsels of tribulations for the rest. The penetration of the state and public agencies into the family are equally underscored by frequent court proceedings regarding custody of children, including their placement in institutions or the recommendation of mental health workers, but against the desperate objection of parents. In short, the material and social legal order in societies work against the oppressed, even though claims abound that they have theoretically, of course, equal rights. Psychological theory and practice permeates by prevailing inequities in ideology, do not therefore necessarily reflect the priorities of the oppressed. A psychology tailored to the needs of the oppressed would give primacy to the attainment of collective liberty. And since such liberty is attained only by collectives would emphasize how best to further the consciousness of and organize action of the collective. It is crucial to emphasize that individualism is not the natural order of life, and that there is no necessary or immutable conflict between personal well-being and social welfare. Rather, an extolling individualism, an ethic that in case is culture bound and seem more tenable to first assert that socially oh my gosh, I'm having a hard time because hold on, let me get this. It's an easy word, but my brain's just like overthinking it. Sociality. Oh, my course. You don't want to say it for me, do you?
Sociality?
I think it's sociality. Oh my God. Yeah, sociality. Is fundamental and definitional to human living. Otherwise, to seek a language, hence communicate, and bound with others, would not be of such pivotal importance in human existence. Without language and sociality, even the elaboration of civilization would be inconceivable. Moreover, to assume a necessary antagonism between the individual and society is to forget that the development of self and even of life itself would be impossible without other people's recognition, nurturance, and cooperation. In asserting these basic facts, one need not to, of course, deny that individual differences in reaction and thresholds do exist. That inspiring to individuality is not necessarily an aberration. That development involves differentiation and integration. Yeah, and functions as in form. That conflict in individuals, between individuals, and among groups occur, and that the relations between individuals and society is by no means always harmonious. The point instead is that sociality, human interdependence, and intersubjectivity offers a more fundamental initial ground for the psychology of a liberation than the assumption of individualism as the natural order of life, or of a belief in a necessary conflict between the individual and society. In short, to begin with how sociality and internalized expressed, modify, and breach in different conditions promised a reliable and realistic foundation for developing a psychology of liberation. Psychology actually is not only embedded in its class and culture context, but it also remains enmeshed in the problems of that context. Some of the ironies establishment psychology has yet to escape include the theoretical fragmentation of human existence under socioeconomic conditions at atomizing reality, thus posing difficulties in elaborating and comprehensive and unified psychology. The commoditization of therapy and friendship in accordance with the law is simply a demand whereby fostering a professional preference to cater and cozy up to those who can most afford but least need help. The over-reliance on the metaphor of the machine to describe human problem in a highly mechanized world, hence confusing people with machines and machines with people, and the assumption of necessary conflict between individuals and society, when in reality the conflict of socio-historical conditions. In earlier chapters, it is argued that the theoretical and methodological preoccupation to control and predict, although undoubtedly leading to fruitful scientific discoveries, has been contormus. Oh, I don't know this word. I tried it. Conterminous. We're gonna look it up. Hope everybody's doing okay. Thank you for staying. I'm just like my throat hurts a little bit. I have a little bit of hoarseness. Conterminous. Two or more things that share the exact same boundaries, limited or duration. Conterminous. With the enduring and bloody history of conquest and domination, the high premium placed by Euro-Americans on mastering nature and hence changing the environment to meet human needs also entailed the elaboration of the world in which some were masters and others were slaves. Evidently, in struggling to control nature, there has been a confusion as to what really constitute, quote, nature, and who indeed qualifies as, quote, human. Our historical highlights have shown that the oppressed were often reduced to objects among other objects of nature, and along with nature, controlled, exploited, and predicted. One may very well thus wonder how much of psychology in universal and how much Euro and classic and class specific, but by what standards and comparisons could such a determination be made when studies of non-Western peoples or the oppressed are seen through the premise of Euro-America and middle-class biases? How can one be certain that prevailing conclusions about say the so-called instincts have universal relevance to people everywhere, or that they rather are the alienated revelations of an alienated social existence? And if mainstream psychology is biased to the ruling group, what orientation and postulations can one derive from the experience of psychology of the oppressed? All right, any questions before I move on to the next section?
Not questions, but as we know as communists, that individualism is a bad thing. And so it would make sense that we should be focusing less on individualism in therapy and psychology as well. That was my only point.
I think what they're trying to do is bring those two things into the same realm with each other, because both affect each other. You know what I mean? There's individuals within a collective unity, and both the collective and the person does affect and draw some kind of relations with each other. So it's not that we don't look at individualism. We don't look at hyper individualism, because there's individuals that exist inside a collective, and all of their social relations do affect each other.
Yeah, but it's saying we need to focus less on individualism, more on community.
Well, we need to tie those two together and see the dialectics between those things, because both have the pathology towards each other. Okay, sorry. From instincts to human needs. Yeah, why not? Psychologists have written extensively on the nature as well as the vicissitudes of instincts and needs. Freud postulates a dual instinct, namely sex and aggression, are perhaps the best known and most closely integrated in psychological theory and practice. But there have also been others, theorists and clinicians, who propose different motives for human behavior to emphasize that there is by no means anonymity of views of what constitutes the most basic instincts for needs of people. One need no detail. For instance, Douglas McDougall's, I can't say his name, cataloging of a battery, for instance, including what he called the, quote, instinct of submission, which he associated with black people. Henry Murray listing the 39 human needs, or Maslow delineation of 5 essential needs. It is worth noting that 60 years ago, Bernard, 1924, had counted some 14,000 instincts postulated in the literature, with many other suggestions since then, and that Gordon Allport aptly pointed out, quote, it is easy to invent instincts according to one's needs. Instincts and needs are both theoretical constructs used to explain the why and the what of behavior. Its underlining goals, regularity, and potentiality. They are a convenient fiction. Better said, hypothesis that many or that may or may not help to describe, explain, and or predict behavior. The notion of instinct, though still retained in psychoanalysis, has gradually been found problematic in psychology, and many replace it with the concept of need, following Murray's formulation, the notion of fixed traits, which, on the one hand, downplays the salience of content, and on the other, limits human possibility, has also been increasingly recognized as unattainable. This becomes most obvious when one considers the claim of social biologists that aggression, xenophobia, and selfishness are innate and dominant features of people, when in reality these claims are but rationalizations for the historical violence, schizoid orientation, and self-centered behavior of a ruling group. I do not intend to carefully evaluate, postulate instincts or needs, but I do want to emphasize that the particular instincts or need one postulates reveals one's conception of human nature, one's view of limits and possibilities, and one's priorities for change. Moreover, postulated instincts and need, insomuch as they have been conceived in a particular social and cultural context, having tended to the biased to the realities of certain groups. It is therefore important to reconsider the question of basic human needs in developing a psychology of liberation and reformulating it in ways that take into account not only the frustrations of, but also the possibilities for the oppressed. To begin with, one very basic, often ignored fact is that the struggle for food and water in many parts of the world can no longer be assumed relevant to human psychology. The psychology of governing an acquisition of food, its distribution, the conditions of shortage loses importance only in social and historical conditions, under which starvation and malnutrition are hardly known, neither as facts of everyday life, nor as ever-present threats. Yet famine, drought, and hunger occur all too frequently in many parts of the world. Folklore, myth, and rituals elaborated in many cultures with respect of food and food shortage shows the salience and sanitation and hunger to human psychology. All right, real quick, I'm gonna go right here. We got like 10 minutes. I want to see. Just remember, I'm on the second paragraph, 277. 277. Just looking ahead. Trying to see where I can find a stopping point, because I got 10 minutes. Okay. 77. So what did I say? 277? Yeah. 77, 78. So we got 4 more pages. So we'll do the 4 pages. Okay. Considering further the amount of time and energy most people spend in cultivating, inquiring, exchanging, and worrying about food, one realized that the everyday realities of a large sector of the world's population have yet to receive attention in psychological circles. Indeed, contact with the poor and powerless majority in the world underscores that shortage of food. It's physical sequel, resulting psychological insults, attendant social and interpersonal conflicts, and associated fantasies dominates and informs human psychology. Thus, any attempt to grapple with the psychology of oppression is incomplete without taking into account the insistent struggle for food. Using experiences from situations of oppression suggests the following basic need and or powers of people. A, biological need, of which the need for food is most basic. 2, B, sociability and rootedness. C, clarity and integrity of self. D, longevity, and symbolic morality. Immorality. E, self-production and praxis. And F, maximum self-determination. Significantly, these basic attributes refer, on the one hand, to essential human need, and on the other, to the essential human power. Each asserts itself as a need to be gratified and turns into a power once gratified. As need, they are actualities to be overcome. As powers, they are potentialities to be realized. But since in reality none of them is absolutely frustrated or completely fulfilled, they simultaneously exist as needs insomuch as they are partially frustrated, and as power insofar as they are partially gratified. Without detailing the dynamics and relationships of these basic human attributes, it is important to stress a few crucial points. Following other theorists, I prefer to consider these attributes a need power term rather than instincts. Although there is some justifications to posit instincts to show that people are part of nature, indications are that an instructionalist orientation posed more problems than it resolves. For one thing, the sole emphasis on man's unity with nature, including animals, ignores that, on the one hand, the most determining and, on the other hand, the most deadly challenge each of us confronts is his own fellow men. Moreover, although listened in some order, these basic attributes are best considered together in their organic and dialectical relations, rather than in isolations or in terms of hierarchies of importance. These basic attributes exist in all people at all times, the most frustrated being those most manifest and pressing in a given temporal and social conditions. This schematic ordering of needs into a pyramid as a Maslow's hierarchy of needs only betrays and enlists outlooks unwittingly mirroring the existing hierarchies of social classes. Also unattainable is the implication that only the rich have the possibility or monopoly of self-actualization. The desire for maximum satisfaction of such biological needs as food, sex, and shelter seems too obvious to require exposition. The desire for sociality and rootedness, as we have already suggested, is equally fundamental, being no less critical than fulfilling biological needs. Sociality is not peculiar to human beings alone. Animals too are social beings, although their behavior is guided and dominated by instinct. Even then, what are instincts but a stored sedimented quote wisdom of a species, requires by the collective and aimed at the perpetuation as well as the enhancement of the collective. Animals may live primarily by instincts, but human beings, to remain human, rely on and live within culture. And at the foundation of culture is sociality. For to acquire culture presupposes not only a remarkable power to learn and teach, but also to enduring capacities for independence and intersubjectivity. Not only the development of our higher powers of cognition and effect, but also the development of our basic sense rest on the fact that we are social beings. In a sense, an infant at birth is a bundle of possibilities, a living candidate to many, but not infinite alternatives, await a series of social, quote, rebirths and self-realization. If failure to satisfy biological need leads to disease and physical death, then denial of human contact, communication, and affirmation, even opposition of others, lead to a social and psychological starvation or death, no less devastating than conditioning physical death. We take this fact for granted precisely because we are so embedded in our social world, realizing the deadly effects of social isolation in such examples as, quote, voodoo death, the concentration camps experiences. We earlier suggested how during the Middle Passage, countless of African slaves suffered from fixed melancholy, a condition of utter shock and grief, remain unmoved by threat or punishment, disproponent, and stripped of their natural bonding. They squatted down with their chains and their knees, their arms around their legs, and died one after another at a remarkable and alarming rate. Psychologists have written extensively on, quote, self-psychology from various perspectives. It would of course take us far beyond intent to review the contributions of psychoanalytic, existential, phenomenological, pageant, or cognitive behavioral writings of the self, its definition, development, and dialectic with the environment. Suffice it to point out that self-psychology has recently attracted the interest of various schools of thought, all of which is different degrees and from different perspectives emphasize that the self, whether considered as a whole person of an individual, a psychic organization, a meaning making system, or otherwise, its invariability embedded and formed in a social world. In other words, the self is a social self, having its origins, affirmation, and transformation of sociality. Am I almost there? Yeah. An infant is born with a body, but not with a self. Later emerges only after birth. Latter only emerges after birth. Following stimulousness, simultaneous processes of maturation in which perceptual ability and coordinated mobility are acquired. The reciprocal interactions with others in a ever-expanding social context. Selfhood can only exist within a body, but it is more than a body in so much as it incorporates aspects of its environment, extended into objects of possession, and represents the human capacity of meaning making. The pursuit of self-clarity is thus intimately bound with the clarity developed first about one's body, the body's boundary, the attributes, and later on, larger world. This pursuit of clarity has survival development and organized values. It entails both differentiation from as well as an integration with others and with one's past. Without some clarity of the self, however tentative and tenuous, there can be no meaningful relating with others, no expression of inherent human potentials, no gratifications of essential needs. In short, no life as we know it. But this process of self-clarity, ending only when the body dies, requires a fundamental respect of one's self-integrity, with the minimal insult to one's being as to one's body. When assaults on one's being are experienced at critical development periods and with certain regularities, self-clarity is hardly attainable, or is at best rendered incomplete and negative. The experiences of oppressed shows not only a centrality of this need for clarity and integrity of the self, but also how structural and formal constraints of oppression results in painful ambiguities and constructions of the self. Despite the best of medical technology, our bodies are soon or later assailed by disease and death. However much we deny it, physical death awaits each of us. The denial is universal, but always incomplete, since consciously Our unconsciously, our inevitable death informs how and for what we live. It is thus never whether or not, but rather how or when, under what condition, and for what ends we shall meet our death. The desire to prolong life is so deeply ingrained in us that we do remarkable things to postpone or at least deny our death. But since our physical death and the consciousness of it haunts us, we relentlessly endeavor to die rather than sooner, or take recourse to avenues of symbolic immortality through our children, social relations, cultural elaborations, theological convictions, and or other methods of transcendence. As Lofton has clearly shown, images of death reduced to basic feelings of separation, disintegration, and stasis, whereas images of life entail social connectedness, bodily integrity, and experience of validity. Earlier, we saw that the oppressed have far higher rates of morbidity and mortality than their oppressors, and what is more, the expropriation of their space, time, and energy, mobility, bonding, and identity results in both psychological and social death. It is significant that the satisfaction of only biological needs cannot by itself maintain human life, and that human history and individual biographies bear ample testimonies that under certain conditions, people do forego physical life rather than accept psychological or social death. The pursuit of longevity and symbolic immortality is hardly attainable and meaningful without some form of purposive engagement through praxis, which by definition is imbued with consciousness and intentionality. By praxis, we refer to one crucial aspect of what psychologists broadly call behavior. To be sure, no equivalence of the two terms is intended. Behavior refers generally to any and all observable humans, as well as animal activity. It is a measurable unit of activity, and it is conceptualization, commonly lacks relational and intentional imports. In meaning and import, praxis is different in at least two ways. First, it refers only to human activity. Second, praxis does not refer to all human activity. Praxis underscores goal-directed and socially meaningful activities that render people's active agents in the world they transform, and they in turn are transformed by it. There are various forms of praxis. Productive labor is, however, praxis per excellence, since it is by means of labor that people elaborate social relations and satisfy their human needs. Unalienated labor is also one effective means through which people individually unveil their implicit identity, objectify it, and collectively build a civilization. It is thus through practice that people reproduce themselves in the objective world, making explicit their personalities and validating themselves as well as their knowledge. The pursuit of self-reproduction through practice makes possible the acquisition of food on which to live, and the realization of social grounding, and the actualization of individuality and potentials. In acting upon transforming our world, what matters is not only the product of one's praxis, but also the very process and fact of activity engaged with others and one's content, and that dialectically happens to be an engagement with oneself as well. That is why experience of alienated labor or forced unemployment both of which are rampant among the oppressed, entail not only a frustration of biological and social needs, but also the ontological impasse of existential stagnation. I thought I had okay, we're almost done. The fulfillment of these needs is possible only when there exists a measure of self-determination. The quest and struggle for self-determination is as fundamental and definitional to people as are the others' needs previously outlined. Little wonder that the right of self-determination is one of the fundamental principles enshrined in the United States Charter and forms the kernel of constitutions of governance, define human rights, as well as responsibilities. Self-determination refers to the process of capacity to choose among alternatives, to determine one's behavior, and to affect one's destiny. As much self-determination assumes a consciousness of human possibilities and awareness of necessary constraints, and the willing, self-motivated engagement with one's world. Self-determination is ultimately bound with the notion and experience of freedom. It is important to emphasize that we are not as free as we wish to be, since structural and historical constraints do exist, and we are not as externally determined as we fear we are, since we do not possess a measure of choice, influence, or control in what happens to us or in what we make happen. History and social conditions presents an alternative, but also constraints. We can choose to act or not to act. But even when we lack alternatives in the world as we find it, we do possess a capacity to interrupt and reinterpret, to adopt one attitude and not another. Without the right of self-determination, we are reduced to rigid and automatic behaviors, to the life and destiny shorn of human will and freedom. Last page. Self-determination is also both the means of fulfilling other human needs and an end into itself. We know for sure that under certain conditions and historical movements, people do not take up arms and risk physical death to retain or reclaim their rights of self-determination. To overlook this fact, as psychologists unfortunately tend to do, is to omit a crucial human dimension and a critical motive of history, to emphasize only the significance and unconscious inner promptings or mechanistic environmental dimensions, underplaying the importance of conscious and organized human agencies, is equally to forget the will change in persons and predicaments is impossible without the right and capacity of self-determination. The powerful influence of the unconscious and of the environment need not, of course, to be denied or underestimated in order to underscore the fact that the pervasive clamor of self-determination among the oppressed reflects one universal aspect of human essence and a persistent project for which all is risked. These basic needs are in reality not fully and equally fulfilled in a world of scarcity, governed by dialectical laws. Conflicts exist among needs, between needs and resources, between technology and the environment, and certainly among people. The needs themselves can reappear in different guises and intensity at any given moment. What appear to be natural needs here and now could be supplanted by artificial needs there and then. The satisfaction of biological needs could turn to its averse, namely avoidance of pain and injury. Sociability may lose ground to narcissistic and self-centered preoccupations. The quest for clarity and integrity of self may degenerate to an adoption of a Manichaean view of self-other, with the violent consequences previously illustrated. The wish for longevity and symbolic immorality may be reduced to an obsession with death, and hence losing ground in joy of being here or living now. The pursuit of self-reproduction through practice may be supplanted by the thoughtless destruction of the environment and the hoarding of material goods. The endeavor to extending self-determination may amount to only the conquest of domination of others. That is, the denial of self-determination of others. And we'll stop there. We'll go to from the adjustment to empowerment. And that is on page 281. Any questions?
No.
No? All right. So it's very important that to have our full faculties is that we identify what our needs, what our human needs, and what keeps us from the human needs. And like for the psychiatrist to place that into the same picture, so that way like we can seek these things and get away from these things and actually really like get away from all these oppressive systems and stuff that keeps us from our full faculties and our self-determination, according to this. So it's important that we do a revolution and that we get rid of all these exploitative things and negate them for things that actually emancipate the person and the groups of people. So 281 is where we stopped, and it will be the from adjustment to empowerment. And I don't know how much more we have left in this book. Oh, maybe tomorrow might be the last day. What?
What are we reading next?
I don't know yet. I'm still thinking. Probably either Amicul Cabral. Start reading Amicul Cabral.
Okay.
No? So looks like we have 10 more pages. So tomorrow might be the last day.